What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and this week we're going to be looking at another Pioneer deck. This one is going to be a monocolored deck, a little bit different from the other decks that we've covered, which, if you have not watched those already, go ahead and consider shooting over and watching those after, obviously, you finish watching this deck. So, Mono Green, as we know, is one of the best decks in the format, with Mono Blue probably not far behind it, just based on the fact of how they kind of attack the metagame, where like Mono Blue is this pseudo-aggressive deck where it gets to play a bunch of small like 1/1 flying creatures and then get to back it up with some counter magic plus getting to draw extra cards with Curious Obsession. And Mono Green just getting to make tons of mana, playing big threats and just playing tons of those big threats in one explosive turn, which I actually saw a lot of this past weekend, which is really sick. And that's a deck that we're going to probably look into again in the really near future. But this deck is a little bit different from all those. So today we're going to be looking at the Mono White Humans deck for Pioneer and why it's the best part of being a budget deck in the format, and also is one of the best aggro decks that you can be playing currently in the format in 2020. So without further ado, let's go over and check out the deck. So here we have the Mono White Humans deck in Pioneer, piloted by John_W. Second place in the Pioneer Challenge, 7-0 in the Swiss. Very, very good. Obviously, really only dropping a match in the finals. So that's really impressive, especially for this deck that's kind of come out of nowhere. I think Mono White was definitely an archetype that existed and people tried to play in some capacity, but kind of got shut out by like the Mono Red and Mono Black aggro decks just from how aggressive that those decks end up being and the kind of reach that they have in a format that was dominated by decks of the old days. But now in this format, I think Mono White definitely has the tools to succeed and can actually be probably near the top of the metagame while also being a pretty budget strategy. As you can see, $122 on tabletop and then actually more expensive on Moto, which I'd actually be interested in seeing what actually makes this deck super expensive. Imagine like a Gajos or something like that. But anyway, before we get too deep into the Mono White Humans deck, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, you should definitely subscribe. I post Pioneer deck techs every week, along with Modern, and trying to get some gameplay mixed in there as well, and some other projects coming down the pipeline in the near future. So, Mono White Humans, like any Mono White deck in the history of Magic, uh, 34 creatures, 4 spells, and those 4 spells are protection spells, so we'll get her out of the way immediately. Brave the Elements is probably one of the best protection spells this deck gets. Unlike the Boros aggro decks that we'd seen that play the creatures that want to be targeted by spells, and we see basically cards that give a single creature protection because it targets. Brave the Elements lets you choose a color, and then white creatures you control gain protection of the chosen color until end of turn. So this can be used obviously in two different ways, offensively and defensively. Offense, you can give your whole team protection from a certain color, whether that be like green or red, decks that want to go up the ground and things like that, that you can just push through tons of damage and really easily push through lethal with something like Brave the Elements. Even getting to like do it in conjunction with some other creatures that you might have that create other creatures, like Adeline the Resplendent Cathar, which can make a 1/1 human that attacks, that's tapped and attacking whenever you attack. So like you could attack with all your things and then brave the elements and then make sure that you give all those creatures protection from a color of your choice. And then defensively as well, you can actually like hang back, have like your huge board of like 1/1s and 2/2s. Obviously some of them being bigger than that, and then getting to like cast a brave the elements and then get to like not lose any of your creatures necessarily in combat, but then also just kind of like nuke your whole opponent's board and then like brave the elements pseudo kind of helps you to get in as well on the next turn, even though it obviously was used defensively. So definitely a very versatile card. Better if you have a lot of creatures. Not so good if you don't have very many, but definitely is an easy way to push through damage and also kind of like win the game on like the defensive side as well. Kind of giving mono white the edge of like, well, if I'm not attacking, I'm losing. Well, now if you're not attacking, you can just kind of like set up to blow your opponent out. So the creatures, of course, is mono white. There is a ton of them. But first, we're going to look at the Dauntless Bodyguards and the Hopeful Initiates, the 4-ofs in the 1-drop slot. Dauntless Bodyguard, played when it was released in the original Dominaria. When it enters the battlefield, you choose another creature you control, and then you can sacrifice it, and that creature gains indestructible. Just a very aggressive creature, a 1 mana 2/1, already really good. Obviously, playing it on turn 1 makes it worse overall because you do not have another creature that you can necessarily protect. But for those aggressive starts, this is very well and isn't necessarily a dead draw on future turns because you can just have this come into play and protect like your Adelenes, your Brutal Cathars, and things like that. Hopeful Initiate is another one that has like the training ability. It's a 1 mana 1/2 that says whenever it attacks another creature with greater power, you put a counter on this creature. And then it even gives you some flexibility to destroy artifacts and enchantments by paying 3 mana or removing 2+1/+1 counters from it. Probably not very ideal. I'd imagine this card is used a lot for just like as an aggressive 1-drop. It's going to more than likely be attacking with creatures with a higher power than it, and it's just going to be able to add counters on it, being like a 2/3, 3/4, or maybe even a 4/5 as well, depending on how big you can get like Adelaide and things like that. The rest of the 1-drops, two Thraben Inspector, which again was another card that was like an all-star back when it was printed in Standard. People just played the heck out of Thraben Inspector because it was a 1 mana 1/2, blocked really well, and it made a clue which you could just eventually cash in for another card on a turn where like you didn't have anything to do with your mana. Still pretty good by today's standards. Obviously not nearly the best 1-drop that you could be playing in any format, but Thraben Inspector nonetheless is still a very good card. And then we have Kytheon, Hero of Akros, which cares about attacking with 2 other creatures, because at the end of combat, if it's attacked with at least 2 other creatures, you exile it and return to the battlefield. Turns into a Planeswalker, can force your opponents to attack it, it can become a creature itself, or until your next turn, your creature you control gains indestructible and you untap it. Let's some of your bigger creatures play offense and defense. Obviously, like Adeline being one of your best creatures just because it can be the biggest. Attacking with like a 5 or 6 power, like Adeline, making a 1/1, and then getting to untap it with Gideon and have it have indestructible. It's going to be just about any creature in combat, almost guaranteed to be like your opponent's biggest creature in combat if they're unable to deal with it. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, getting to be a 4/4 creature on its own, you prevent all damage dealt to it while it's a creature is also just very aggressive as well, considering like your one mana 2/1 essentially then becomes a 4/4, which is really good. The 2-drop slot. So this is where some of the more like utility slash like uh, go wide slash go big kind of comes into effect here. You have Luminarch Aspirant, which is a 2 mana 1/1 that at the beginning of combat in your turn, you put a counter on a creature you control. Um, Very self-explanatory. Obviously, you can either have this be a 2/2 the turn that you play it, or you can like put the counter on something else, and then like your hopeful initiates can kind of get bigger and like get counters. There's like ways that you can spread out the power that this deck can build among all the creatures to where you can get the most value out of all your things, and Aspirant does that very well by making like your creatures like one turn at a time. Obviously, get bigger. Um, Essentially, Luminarch, while itself is not very powerful, being a 1/1, the counters that it distributes are huge, especially if games go long and you continue to have like board stalls and things like that, where you're just trying to hold out for a Brave the Elements, or just hoping to have enough Aspirants and Thalia's Lieutenants, which we'll get to here in a second, to just eventually have a big enough board to go after your opponent and force some bad blocks on their end. Next, we have Thalia's Lieutenant, or Thalia's Lieutenant, one of my favorite names, I think, for one of my favorite Magic commentators, Riley Knight, to ever say. And there was a whole Pro Tour where he said it a lot, so it's great. Thalia's Lieutenant enters the battlefield. It puts a counter on each other human you control, and then it has the same as the Champion of the Parish, which is a modern staple for the humans deck. Where if another human enters the battlefield in your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Thalia's Lieutenant. This is just another way where you can either like play this on turn 2, and you maybe put the counter on like one creature like a Dauntless Bodyguard or a Hopeful Initiate, and then like as you play humans, this gets bigger. Or you could play this as your last card and just make all of your other creatures bigger, depending on what you feel is necessary. If you just need one big creature to kind of push through damage and you don't think you need to go wide, Lieutenant can go big. If you need to go wide, Lieutenant can go wide. While also just making subsequent like human draws, like you put counters on it as well. Finally, we have the last 4 of in the deck in the 2-drop slot is the Thalia Guardian of Thraben. Was a modern staple for a long time just for the fact that it made non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. 2 mana 2/1 with first strike, very good, wins a lot of combat, and obviously like the more that you had counters and stuff on it, The harder it is to kill it because it is taxing your opponent to play spells and it is forcing them to have more spells, which means they need to have more mana, which means they might just go after other creatures, but like they still have to pay that extra mana to like cast things and stuff. This can really help against like some of the combo decks, like the Lotus Field combo decks, the Phoenix decks where they want to cast like 3 spells in a turn to get back their Phoenixes. Dahlia making all those spells cost 1 more makes it very hard. It means they have to wait later to do it, which if the game is if you're making your opponent go longer before doing their thing, you're probably winning as the mono white deck if they're not able to deal with your board. Lastly, we have Tomic Distinguished Advocist. Uh, a little bit weirder. We haven't seen this card. I mean, it came out in War of the Spark. It's a weird card. Lands on the battlefield and lands in your in graveyards can't be the target spells or abilities your opponents controls, and your opponents can't play land cards from graveyards. So this actually stops your opponent from targeting their land, like their Lotus Field specifically, with cards that have untap effects. There's also, I'm sure, like cards in the Pioneer format that you can play like cards from your graveyard to make use of like the second half of Tomic's abilities. But really, like you're looking at the first part, where it lands on the battlefield and graveyard can be the target spells or abilities your opponents control, just completely shuts down that deck. On top of that, Tomik just is super aggressive, being a 2 mana 2/3 flyer that obviously gets the counters and the benefits from all the other cards that care about humans. In the humans deck, that's just a crazy revelation to come to. Finally, we're at the 3-drop slot. This is kind of where the deck tops out, which is kind of weird because it plays 22 lands, but we'll get to that in a second. Adeline Resplendent Cathar, beautiful art, super hard to read if you're just like watching the video, but Adeline basically is a 3 mana star 4 with vigilance, where its power is equal to the number of creatures you control, and whenever you attack for each opponent, you create a 1/1 human that is tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. So essentially, in like 1v1 games, Adeline just makes a 1/1 when it attacks, but it's whenever you attack. So you can actually leave Adeline back. You can attack with like a 2/1, and then you make a 1/1 that's also attacking. This definitely snowballs out of control. Obviously, it makes Adeline bigger turn by turn. It makes a white creature, so it benefits from like Brave the Elements, and it's a human, so future Thalia's lieutenants and things like that definitely get bigger from it as well. This is probably by far one of your best creatures, just because it lets you beat down super quickly and punishes your opponent for being slow. The final 4 of in the 3-drop slot is Brutal Cathar. When it enters or transforms, you exile a creature an opponent controls until this card leaves. Um, it's a 3 mana 2/2, which isn't like super impressive, but it has the Daybound Nightbound mechanic. So if a player on their active turn does not cast a spell, you transform it. And then when it's Moonrage Brute, it's a 3/3 with first strike and ward, makes them pay 3 life. So if they want to get back some of their things, they're going to have to pay the tax from Thalia and then also pay the tax from the Moonrage Brute to essentially get rid of this card. And that's a lot of mana and a lot of life, especially in a deck that is just constantly pressuring your life total from turn after turn. While it's probably not your best creature, it's definitely one of the ways that you can push through damage that is not Brave the Elements. Finally, the last 2 creatures, Elite Spellbinder and Extraction Specialist. Elite Spellbinder lets you look at your opponent's hand, you exile a non-land card from it, and as long as it remains exiled, the owner may play it, but they have to pay 2 more to cast it. Just a very good effect, a 3 mana 3/1 flyer, super aggressive. Obviously can get bigger, and it's hard to deal with a 4/5 power flyer in Pioneer to begin with. If you're short of like removal spells, and nothing can really like block this thing without trading, which obviously Spellbinder gets its value by stealing a card from your opponent. And if it gets in like a few hits, that's a ton of damage for like a 3 mana spell. That's really great. And finally, Extraction Specialist, which is a card that's actually probably a lot better than I think people give it credit for. 3 mana 3/2 with lifelink. Pretty good when you're playing against like other aggro decks. Lifelink definitely helps out a lot. When it enters, you actually return a creature with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature can't attack or block as long as Extraction Specialist is in play. But you get to bring cards back like Dauntless Bodyguard, Thraben Inspector, Luminarch Aspirant, like Thalia's Lieutenant. Even like a Thalia Guardian of Thraben is fine. Tomik as well, but mostly those cards. Obviously, bringing it back, Lieutenant gets its value by coming back and putting counters on tons of things. Luminarch Aspirant doesn't need to attack; it can just put counters on your creatures from Luminarch Aspirant and obviously get in that way. Thurman Inspector eventually just lets you draw a card and things of that nature. It definitely has a lot of utility and can accomplish a lot, honestly, for 3 mana. And just being a 3/2 body as well, that gets the value from getting bigger. And obviously, Lifelink being able to swing races in your favor is really sweet. Finally, the mana base, 12 planes, super easy. The 4 Mutavault because it's a cheap creature that we can activate. A Gonjo is essentially like a removal spell plus another white source. Castle Ardenvale, getting to make 1/1 humans for essentially 4 mana and tapping it. Not really the best place to be, but can definitely just be a way that you can kind of like keep creatures on the battlefield against like control decks and things like that. In Shafet Dunes, another land that requires 4 mana and tapping it to do something, but this lets you give an Anthem effect to your whole team by sacrificing the Shafet Dunes to itself or another Shafet Dunes to the Shafet Dunes and just push through a ton of damage and or kill your opponent. Sideboard, Portable Hole to get through some of like the other like decks to try to go up the ground. Containment Priest because Reanimator and people that are trying to cheat are not fun. Mainly for like the mono green decks, I believe. Rest in Peace for like Phoenix, Selfless Spirit against like the control decks slash like heavy removal decks. Tomik for those pesky Lotus Field players. Archon also for the Lotus Field players, as well as some of the like Phoenix decks and things like that, just because it's hard to remove without casting multiple spells. And a second Extraction Specialist in the sideboard, because again, value is value for the mono white deck. And that's the mono white deck for Pioneer. Overall, I would say a great budget option as well as just a very powerful deck. You can definitely be rewarded for how you sequence things and just being able to read and react to what like your opponent does and understanding matchups as a whole. Most of the time you want to be on the beat down with this deck, but definitely picking and choosing when you want to make trades or when you want to push damage is super important. And if you can manage to do that while playing this deck, then picking up any of the other aggressive decks or maybe getting to some other decks in the format as well will be a piece of cake. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, leave a like on the video. Comment down below if you've played Mono White Humans, want to play Mono White Humans, or just think the deck is garbage. Let me know in the comments. And join the Discord that I have linked in the description. Pretty bare bones for now, but if we get more people, we get more people talking about Magic and stuff, we can add new groups and such and things as we go on. But yeah, that's gonna do it for me this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next one.